The silence in my mother's dining room didn't feel like peace. It felt like an incoming tide, cold and heavy, pulling the oxygen right out of my lungs. I looked down at my lap, focusing on a single, jagged thread loose on my skirt, because looking up meant acknowledging the grease dripping onto the hardwood floor. To my left, Evan was unnervingly still. My 9-year-old son, a boy who usually had a joke or a question for every second of the day, had been reduced to a statue of pure, unadulterated shame. I could hear the rhythmic, wet sound of something thick hitting the floor. Drip. Plop. Drip. It was the only sound in the room, save for the rhythmic clinking of my brother Daniel's fork against his fine china. He was eating his peas one by one, his movements graceful and calculated, as if he hadn't just shattered the dignity of a child. He didn't look like a man who had lost his temper. He looked like a man who had successfully performed a necessary, clinical operation. Across the table, my mother, Linda, was staring intensely at the center of the floral centerpiece, her mouth pressed into a thin, white line of practiced ignorance. My father, Robert, took a slow, deliberate sip of his Cabernet, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid as if it held the answers to why his family was rotting from the inside out. I felt the coldness starting in my fingertips and working its way toward my heart. It wasn't the kind of anger that makes you want to scream. It was the kind that makes you want to vanish. My son's favorite blue polo shirt, the one he had picked out specifically because Uncle Daniel likes blue, was ruined. The fabric was heavy and dark, soaked through with the remnants of a meal that was supposed to celebrate a promotion, a homecoming, a family. Instead, it had become a crime scene of the spirit. I could smell the rosemary and the heavy cream of the sauce, a scent that used to mean safety and Sunday afternoons, now turned cloying and sour in the heat of the room. I didn't reach for a napkin. I didn't gasp. I just sat there, suspended in that horrific mid-moment where the world has already ended, but the clock hasn't realized it yet. Heather, Daniel's wife, was carefully wiping a microscopic splash of gravy from her own sleeve, her expression one of mild annoyance, as if my son's humiliation was merely an inconvenience to her dry cleaning bill. No one was looking at Evan. It was as if by ignoring the boy covered in food, they could pretend the act itself hadn't happened. I finally turned my head to look at my son. His eyes were squeezed shut, his small shoulders hunched toward his ears, waiting for the next blow, or perhaps waiting for the world to open up and swallow him whole. A single tear tracked through the thick, brown sauce on his cheek, leaving a pale, clean line in its wake. He wasn't crying out. He was leaking. That broke me more than a scream ever could. I looked at Daniel, whose eyes finally met mine over the rim of his wine glass. There was no apology there. There wasn't even heat. There was only a cold, terrifying sense of rightness. He thought he had done something good. He thought he had established an order that I was too weak to maintain. I realized then that the people at this table weren't my safety net, they were the ones who had cut the ropes. But as Daniel opened his mouth to deliver the final, crushing blow of the evening, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't going to play the victim in his twisted play anymore. I leaned in, my voice a whisper that cut through the clinking silverware like a razor. I didn't say what they expected. I didn't beg for them to stop. I simply asked the one question that made Daniel's hand freeze midair. The question I had asked Daniel hung in the air, but the answer was already written in the marrow of my bones. It was the same answer that had been reinforced since we were children. To understand why my brother felt he had the right to dump a bowl of gravy over my son's head, you have to understand the architecture of the Monroe household. In our house, there was a hierarchy as rigid as the steel beams of a skyscraper, and Daniel was always at the very top. He was the golden child, a term people use lightly now, but back then, it was a heavy, physical reality. My parents didn't just love him, they worshipped the potential of him. Daniel was the star quarterback, the honor roll student, the boy whose every achievement was framed in gold leaf on the hallway walls. I was the shadow that moved between those frames, the helper whose primary job was to ensure Daniel's path was clear of obstacles. I remember the Saturdays spent at his games, my mother clutching her chest with every play he made, while I sat on the cold bleachers, my own interests, art, books, my quiet thoughts, tucked away like secrets. My mother, Linda, used to tell me, "Rachel, honey, just make sure Daniel's jersey is clean. He has a big day tomorrow." She didn't ask how my school project was going. She didn't notice when I stayed up late studying for exams that I would eventually ace, only for my report card to be glanced at for 5 seconds before the conversation pivoted back to Daniel's college scouts. This imbalance was normalized until it became the very air we breathed. If Daniel was loud, he was assertive. If I was loud, I was difficult. If Daniel broke a rule, it was teenage rebellion or blowing off steam. If I tripped over a rule, it was a character flaw that needed correcting. I grew up thinking that my value was directly tied to how much I could facilitate Daniel's comfort. I was the invisible hand that kept the machinery of his ego running. Even back then, there were signs of the cruelty that would eventually manifest at the dinner table. I remember him breaking my favorite porcelain doll, a gift from my grandmother, just to see if I would cry. When I did, my father told me I was being too sensitive over a toy, while my mother comforted Daniel because he felt bad about the accident. The accident that wasn't an accident. It was the first time I saw that specific glint in his eyes, the same one I saw tonight over the gravy boat. It was the look of a person who realizes they can cause pain and face zero consequences. My parents didn't see a bully in the making. They saw a leader who knew how to take charge. They paved the way for the man he became, a man who believes his sister's son is just another doll he can break to assert his dominance. Looking at my mother now, sitting there in her silent complicity, I realized she wasn't just ignoring the mess on the floor. She was protecting the investment she had made in her golden son 30 years ago. If she acknowledged his cruelty now, she would have to acknowledge her own failure as a mother back then. She would have to admit that she raised a monster in a designer suit. The imbalance hadn't changed, it had just scaled up. I wasn't just the helper anymore, I was the target. And Evan, poor, innocent Evan, was the collateral damage in a war that started before he was even born. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't just been invited to dinner, I had been invited to a ritual of humiliation that had been 30 years in the making. My path to that dinner table hadn't been paved with the gold my brother enjoyed. It was forged in the kind of fire that either breaks you or turns you into tempered steel. While Daniel was climbing the corporate ladder in Chicago, fueled by my parents' constant praise and financial safety nets, I was learning the hard way what the world looks like when you don't have a champion. I had married young, a man named Mark who possessed a quiet kindness that felt like a sanctuary after a lifetime of Daniel's loud ego. For a few years, I lived in a world where my voice mattered. We built a life in a modest, sun-drenched apartment in a quiet suburb, filling it with second-hand furniture and the kind of laughter that doesn't have a sharp edge. When Evan was born, he became the center of that universe. He wasn't a project or a legacy like Daniel was to my father. He was a person. A small, miraculous person with his father's gentle temperament and my own stubborn streak of resilience. But the sanctuary didn't last. Loss has a way of stripping you down to your most basic elements. When Mark passed away suddenly, an accident, a heartbeat, a phone call that changed everything, the golden son and my parents were nowhere to be found in the wreckage. They sent flowers. They attended the funeral in expensive black wool, looking like a mournful ad in a lifestyle magazine. But when the dirt was settled and the bills started piling up, the Monroe support system was silent. I became a single mother in the most literal sense of the word. I worked 2 jobs, navigating the exhausting landscape of American childcare and rising rent, all while making sure Evan never felt the weight of my fear. I became the woman who could fix a leaky faucet with a YouTube tutorial and a butter knife, the woman who could stretch a grocery budget across 2 weeks like it was a magic trick. Through it all, Evan was my anchor. He was the reason I woke up at 5 in the morning to prep school lunches before heading to an office where I was just another face in a cubicle. Despite their neglect, I stayed loyal. That's the trap of a family like mine. You keep showing up to the Sunday dinners. You keep sending the birthday cards. You keep playing the role of the quiet, struggling sister because you hope that one day, they will see you. I quietly supported them in the ways I could, listening to my mother's endless complaints about her bridge club, helping my father organize his retirement accounts when Daniel was too busy with a merger to take a call. I was the reliable one. The one who didn't ask for much, so they assumed I didn't need much. I let them think I was the unlucky one, the one who had fumbled her potential by marrying a man without a pedigree and ending up alone. I took their subtle jabs and their backhanded compliments for years, all to keep the peace for Evan. I wanted him to have a family. I wanted him to know his grandparents. I thought that by being the bigger person, I was protecting him. I didn't realize that my silence was actually a permission slip for Daniel. By never standing up for myself as an adult, I had signaled to my brother that I was still that invisible helper girl from 30 years ago. I had brought my son into a lion's den, thinking it was a living room. I looked at Evan now, his small hand clutching mine under the table, his polo shirt heavy with cold gravy, and the guilt was a physical weight in my stomach. I had worked so hard to give him a life of dignity, only to hand him over to the one person who knew exactly how to strip it away. My resilience wasn't a shield for him tonight. It was a witness to his pain. As I sat there, the reliable daughter died, and something much more dangerous took its place. I realized that being the bigger person is just another way of saying you're a bigger target. I was done being the support beam for a house that was designed to crush me. The air in the room didn't just feel cold, it felt toxic, saturated with the kind of entitlement that only grows in the absence of consequences. Daniel didn't even look at the mess he had made on Evan's head. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his vintage Cabernet, swirling the liquid in the crystal glass as if he were savoring the metallic tang of his own cruelty. To Daniel, this wasn't an outburst, it was an act of governance. He had always viewed our family as a kingdom he inherited by birthright, and as the successful sibling, the one with the high-rise condo in the city and the car that cost more than my annual salary, he felt he had earned the right to police everyone else's existence. He looked over at Heather, who was delicately dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. She caught his eye and gave a faint, approving nod, a silent pact between two people who believed that the world owed them everything and everyone else was just an extra in their movie. "You see, Rachel," Daniel started, his voice dripping with a condescending pity that made my skin crawl, "the problem with your gentle parenting is that it produces soft results. In the real world, no one cares if you're a gentle soul. They care if you can follow instructions and hold your position." He gestured vaguely at Evan with his fork. The boy was slouching. He was daydreaming. I gave him a correction he won't forget. "You should be thanking me for stepping in where you've clearly failed." The audacity of his words was breathtaking. He spoke as if he were a philanthropist donating his time to a charity case. This was the Daniel I had seen at every adult gathering for the last decade. The man who would make jokes about my modest apartment, or offer career advice that was really just a way to remind me I was a low-level administrator while he was a vice president. He lived for the public assertion of dominance. At Christmas, it was him buying the most expensive gifts just to make mine look pathetic. At Thanksgiving, it was him taking over the carving of the turkey because he didn't trust my father's weak hands. He thrived on the quiet submission of those around him. He looked at me now, expecting me to stammer an excuse or, better yet, to start cleaning up the mess while apologizing for Evan's disruption. That was the script we had followed for years. I would swallow my pride, Evan would hide his face, and the Monroe family machine would keep grinding along. But the entitlement in his eyes was blinding tonight. He truly believed he was untouchable. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, a posture my mother would have scolded me for, but for Daniel, it was a power move. "Don't give me that look, Rachel. You're always so dramatic. It's just a little gravy. It'll wash out. What won't wash out is the weakness you're instilling in him. If you can't handle the way this family operates, maybe you shouldn't be at the table." Heather chimed in then, her voice a sharp, brittle chime. "He's right, Rachel. It's about standards. We have a certain way of doing things in this house. If Evan can't respect the decorum, it's a reflection on you." She said this while looking at her manicured nails, as if the very sight of my son's distress was a bore. The two of them sat there like a jury that had already decided the verdict before the trial began. Daniel wasn't just my brother in that moment. He was the physical embodiment of every person who had ever looked down on me for being a single mother, for being poor, for being quiet. He was the villain who didn't even know he was the villain because he had been told his whole life that his breath was a gift to the room. He was waiting for my break, for my tears, for the hysterics he could use to justify kicking us out. But as I looked at him, I realized his overconfidence was his greatest weakness. He thought I was still playing by the old rules. He had no idea that the game had changed the second that gravy hit my son's skin. The air in the room didn't just feel cold, it felt toxic, saturated with the kind of entitlement that only grows in the absence of consequences. Daniel didn't even look at the mess he had made on Evan's head. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his vintage Cabernet, swirling the liquid in the crystal glass as if he were savoring the metallic tang of his own cruelty. To Daniel, this wasn't an outburst, it was an act of governance. He had always viewed our family as a kingdom he inherited by birthright, and as the successful sibling, the one with the high-rise condo in the city and the car that cost more than my annual salary, he felt he had earned the right to police everyone else's existence. He looked over at Heather, who was delicately dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. She caught his eye and gave a faint, approving nod, a silent pact between two people who believed that the world owed them everything and everyone else was just an extra in their movie. "You see, Rachel," Daniel started, his voice dripping with a condescending pity that made my skin crawl. The problem with your gentle parenting is that it produces soft results. In the real world, no one cares if you're a gentle soul. They care if you can follow instructions and hold your position. He gestured vaguely at Evan with his fork. The boy was slouching. He was daydreaming. I gave him a correction he won't forget. You should be thanking me for stepping in where you've clearly failed. The audacity of his words was breathtaking. He spoke as if he were a philanthropist donating his time to a charity case. This was the Daniel I had seen at every adult gathering for the last decade. The man who would make jokes about my modest apartment or offer career advice that was really just a way to remind me I was a low-level administrator while he was a vice president. He lived for the public assertion of dominance. At Christmas, it was him buying the most expensive gifts just to make mine look pathetic. At Thanksgiving, it was him taking over the carving of the turkey because he didn't trust my father's weak hands. He thrived on the quiet submission of those around him. He looked at me now, expecting me to stammer an excuse or, better yet, to start cleaning up the mess while apologizing for Evan's disruption. That was the script we had followed for years. I would swallow my pride, Evan would hide his face, and the Monroe family machine would keep grinding along. But the entitlement in his eyes was blinding tonight. He truly believed he was untouchable. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, a posture my mother would have scolded me for, but for Daniel, it was a power move. Don't give me that look, Rachel. You're always so dramatic. It's just a little gravy. It'll wash out. What won't wash out is the weakness you're instilling in him. If you can't handle the way this family operates, maybe you shouldn't be at the table. Heather chimed in then, her voice a sharp, brittle chime. He's right, Rachel. It's about standards. We have a certain way of doing things in this house. If Evan can't respect the decorum, it's a reflection on you. She said this while looking at her manicured nails, as if the very sight of my son's distress was a bore. The two of them sat there like a jury that had already decided the verdict before the trial began. Daniel wasn't just my brother in that moment. He was the physical embodiment of every person who had ever looked down on me for being a single mother, for being poor, for being quiet. He was the villain who didn't even know he was the villain because he had been told his whole life that his breath was a gift to the room. He was waiting for my break, for my tears, for the hysterics he could use to justify kicking us out. But as I looked at him, I realized his overconfidence was his greatest weakness. He thought I was still playing by the old rules. He had no idea that the game had changed the second that gravy hit my son's skin. The most devastating part of the evening wasn't the heat of the gravy or the coldness of Daniel's voice. It was the rhythmic, hollow sound of my father's knife scraping against his plate. Robert Monroe was a man of industry, a man who had spent 40 years managing people, yet he couldn't manage a single word of defense for his own grandson. He kept his head down, his jaw working mechanically as he chewed a piece of meat that must have tasted like ash. My father's silence wasn't a lack of opinion, it was a deliberate, tactical choice. In the Monroe household, silence was the currency used to purchase peace at any price, even the price of a child's dignity. I looked at him, waiting for the enough that never came. I waited for the hand to slam on the table in defense of the 9-year-old sitting 3 feet away from him. But Robert just reached for the salt shaker, his eyes avoiding mine with a dexterity that only comes from decades of looking away from things that are uncomfortable. Then there was my mother, Linda. If my father was the silent wall, my mother was the architect of the illusion. She finally looked up, but not at Evan. She looked at me with a pained, weary expression, as if I were the one causing the scene. Rachel, she sighed, her voice soft and weaponized with fake empathy. Don't make this a thing. You know how Daniel gets when he's stressed from work. He just wants what's best for the family. Why do you always have to be so sensitive? You're going to ruin the evening for everyone. It was a classic Linda move, the pivot. In her world, the crime wasn't the assault on my son, the crime was my reaction to it. She was gaslighting me in real time, rewriting the narrative so that my brother's cruelty was just stress and my son's humiliation was a distraction. She reached out and patted my hand, her skin dry and papery. Just take him to the bathroom, clean him up, and come back out. I've already started the coffee. Let's just move past this. She spoke to me like I was a child who had tripped in the playground, not a mother whose child had been degraded. Her manipulation was subtle, honed over years of protecting Daniel's image. She didn't want to see the gravy in Evan's hair because that would mean acknowledging that her golden son was a bully. If she could convince me to stay, She could convince herself that nothing bad had happened. She was more worried about the evening than she was about the psychic wound being inflicted on her grandson. It was psychological warfare wrapped in the guise of maternal advice. I withdrew my hand from hers, and the look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face was almost comical. She expected the good daughter to comply. She expected me to prioritize her comfort over my son's safety. I realized in that moment that my parents weren't just bystanders. They were the enablers who had built the pedestal Daniel stood on. Their silence was a loud, echoing approval. Their moving on was a betrayal more profound than Daniel's initial act. They had chosen the status quo over the truth. They had chosen their son's ego over their daughter's heart. I saw the hierarchy clearly for the first time. There was Daniel, then my parents' comfort, then the family image, and somewhere deep in the dirt, there was me and Evan. The realization was a cold splash of water to my face. I wasn't just fighting my brother. I was fighting a system that had been designed to keep me small and him large. The complicity in the room was a thick, invisible fog, and I knew that if I stayed, I would drown in it. My mother's smile faltered when she realized I wasn't moving toward the bathroom. I was moving toward the exit. The dining room had been a pressure cooker long before the gravy boat was tilted. We need to go back to the 20 minutes leading up to the snap, to the way the air felt as we sat down. It was supposed to be a celebration of Daniel's new vice presidency, a title that apparently gave him the right to act as the supreme arbiter of our lives. The table was set with the good china, the gold-rimmed plates that only came out when Daniel was in town. I remember the way the silver felt cold in my hand, a sharp contrast to the forced warmth of the conversation. My mother had spent all day in the kitchen, and the smell of roasting meat was everywhere, but it felt heavy, almost suffocating. Evan was sitting next to me, his legs swinging slightly under the table, a nervous habit he developed whenever he felt the Monroe chill. He was trying so hard to be perfect. He had even let me slick his hair back, wanting to look like the grown-ups. The jabs started small, like tiny pebbles being thrown at a window. Daniel had spent the first 10 minutes talking about his new assistant's incompetence, a story that was really just a vehicle to showcase his own brilliance. Then, his eyes landed on Evan. "So, Evan," Daniel said, his fork poised mid-air. "I heard you got a B in math this term. Your cousin Leo, my son, just took the state exams. He placed in the top 1%. You've got to tighten up, kid. A B is just a polite way of saying you're falling behind." I felt Evan's body stiffen beside me. He had worked so hard for that B, overcoming a mid-year struggle with fractions that had brought him to tears more than once. I had been so proud of him. But in this room, a B was a failure of the bloodline. I opened my mouth to defend him, but my father interjected first. "Daniel's right, Rachel. Competition is healthy. It builds character. You can't coddle him forever." The comparison was the fuel Daniel needed. He spent the next few minutes detailing Leo's soccer schedule, Leo's private tutors, and Leo's natural leadership. Every accolade for his son was a subtle indictment of mine. It was a slow-burn psychological siege. He wasn't yelling. He was just eroding Evan's confidence with a smile on his face. He'd look at Evan's plate and make a comment about cleanliness or discipline, watching as my son grew smaller and smaller in his chair. I could see the tension in Evan's small jaw, the way he was trying to swallow his food through a throat that was clearly closing up with anxiety. I tried to redirect the conversation to my mother's garden, but Daniel wouldn't let go. He was like a dog with a bone. He wanted to assert that his branch of the family tree was the only one that mattered. The room grew darker as the sun set outside, the golden hour light turning into long, predatory shadows on the walls. The clinking of silverware became the only punctuation in Daniel's monologue. Every time I tried to speak, Heather would cut me off with a question about a brand of handbag I couldn't afford or a vacation spot I'd never visit. They were building a wall of status around us, making sure we knew we were only there by the grace of their invitation. The tension was a physical cord stretched tight across the table, vibrating with every passive-aggressive comment Daniel made. I looked at the clock on the wall, the rhythmic ticking matching the pounding in my head. I kept telling myself, just one more hour. Just get through dessert. I didn't realize that the B in math was just the opening act. Daniel was looking for a reason to break the cord entirely, and he was watching Evan's every move, waiting for the slightest infraction to justify the cruelty he had been rehearsing in his mind all afternoon. The visual aid wasn't a sudden impulse. It was the climax of a performance he had been preparing since he pulled into the driveway. The air in the dining room didn't just feel heavy, it felt curdled. Daniel's eyes had locked onto Evan with the predatory precision of a hawk watching a field mouse. My son had reached for his water glass, his hand trembling just enough to cause a tiny, almost invisible ripple in the liquid. A single drop escaped the rim and landed on the pristine white linen tablecloth. To any normal person, it was a non-event. To Daniel, it was a declaration of war. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. He didn't yell. He didn't scold. He simply stood up, and the scraping of his heavy oak chair against the floor sounded like a scream in the sudden silence. My heart hammered against my ribs as he reached for the large, ceramic gravy boat sitting in the center of the table. It was still half full of the thick, rosemary-scented reduction my mother had spent 3 hours perfecting. "You are a mess, Evan," Daniel said, his voice terrifyingly devoid of emotion. "You are a stain on this family's standards. If you can't keep your seat clean, then you don't deserve to be clean yourself." Before I could even process the words, he tilted his wrist. I watched in a sickening, cinematic slow motion as the viscous, brown liquid cascaded through the air. It hit the top of Evan's head with a wet, heavy thud. It was hot, not enough to scald, but enough to shock. The gravy pooled in his hair, thick and oily, before beginning its slow, humiliating descent down his face. It coated his eyelashes, clogged his ears, and soaked into the collar of his shirt. Evan's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. He just sat there, the weight of the food pulling his head down, while the smell of fat and herbs filled the air like a taunt. "There," Daniel whispered, leaning over the table, his face illuminated by the flickering candles. "Now the outside matches the inside. Messy. Disorganized. Weak." He looked at me then, a jagged smile cutting across his face. "And you, Rachel. You're the reason he's like this. Your failure as a mother is an embarrassment to this name. I won't have my home, or my parents' home, sullied by your mediocrity any longer." He straightened his tie with a sharp, brisk motion. "Get out. Both of you. Now. I don't want to see your faces for the rest of the night. Take your mess and leave before I decide to show you what real discipline looks like." As I washed the dried gravy out of Evan's hair, the water turning a murky, grayish-brown, I felt the weight of the consequences shifting. It wasn't just about their anger. It was about the death of my expectations. I was mourning the parents I thought I had, and the brother I had hoped would eventually grow a soul. The consequence for them was that they had lost their helper. They had lost the person who made them feel good about themselves by being the one who always tolerated their cruelty. They didn't realize it yet, but the foundation of their family dynamic was built on my willingness to be small. By standing up, I had pulled the thread that would eventually unravel the whole tapestry. I watched the last of the rosemary-scented grease swirl down the drain. The delayed payoff was a cold, hard certainty. They expected me to call by morning, desperate for their approval. They didn't know that for the first time in my life, I was perfectly content with being the villain in their story, as long as I was the hero in my son's. The healing didn't happen in a single, cinematic moment of realization. It happened in the quiet, mundane spaces of our new life. In the weeks following that dinner, I did something I should have done years ago. I changed the locks, not just on my doors, but on my heart. I stopped answering the calls that were designed to guilt me, and I stopped seeking the validation of people who saw my son as a target for their own insecurities. We traded the suffocating, gold-rimmed dinners at my parents' house for a life that was smaller, simpler, and infinitely lighter. Our chosen family began to fill the gaps, friends who didn't care about standards but cared deeply about whether Evan felt safe. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a retired teacher who saw the world through kindness rather than competition, became the grandmother figure Evan actually deserved. Our Friday nights were no longer about performing for Daniel. They were about pizza on the floor and high-stakes games of Monopoly where the only discipline was a laugh for landing on boardwalk. Evan's healing was a slow, beautiful unfolding. For the first few weeks, he was jumpy. He would look at me tentatively if he spilled a drop of juice, his body bracing for a lecture that was never going to come. Every time, I would just hand him a cloth and tell him it was okay, that things are meant to be used and messes are meant to be cleaned. I watched the tension slowly drain from his shoulders over the months. He started talking more. He started sharing his math progress again, not because he was afraid of a B, but because he was proud of what he was learning. We spent afternoons at the local park, where I watched him run and yell and be the 9-year-old boy he was always meant to be. There was no one there to tell him he was soft or weak. There was only the sun on his face and the freedom to breathe. I found a new strength in the silence. There was a profound relief in not having to manage Daniel's ego or my mother's peacekeeping delusions. I realized that reconciliation isn't always the happy ending. Sometimes, the happy ending is the absence of the person who hurts you. I didn't need an apology from Daniel to move on. I just needed to make sure he never had the opportunity to touch our lives again. My parents sent letters, mostly complaining about how divided the family had become, but I read them with the detachment of a scientist observing a distant, dying star. Their drama was no longer my weather. I looked at Evan one evening while we were sitting on our small porch, watching the fireflies. He was leaning back, his posture relaxed, his eyes bright with a story he was telling me about a book he'd finished. He wasn't the boy covered in gravy anymore. He was a boy who knew he was loved unconditionally. I realized then that by walking out of that dining room, I hadn't just saved him from a meal. I had saved him from a legacy of shame. We were rebuilding a life where the only standard was how well we treated each other. The wreckage of the Monroe family was far behind us, and for the first time in my life, the air didn't feel heavy. It just felt like home. The memory of that night has a way of returning when the house is quiet, but it no longer carries the sting of shame. People often ask why I didn't scream. They ask why I didn't grab the gravy boat and pour it back over Daniel's expensive suit, or why I didn't demand that my father stand up and be a man. But anger is a fire that requires oxygen, and I decided that night that my family's drama would no longer get a single breath of mine. I remember the weight of the foyer door in my hand and the way the shadows of the hallway seemed to stretch toward us like grasping fingers. Daniel was standing there, his face flushed with the triumph of a bully who thinks he's won. He was waiting for my parting shot, a slur, a curse, a plea. He wanted me to give him something he could use to prove I was the unstable one. I turned back just enough to see them all one last time. My mother, looking at her nails. My father, looking at his plate. And my brother, looking at me with that wretched, entitled smirk. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let a single tear blur my vision. I looked Daniel straight in the eye, and I said the one thing that I knew would haunt the silence of that house long after we were gone. I said, I'm leaving you exactly where you deserve to be, alone with each other. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was a sudden, flickering realization of the truth. Without me to look down on, without Evan to correct, they were just a room full of mirrors, reflecting their own hollowness back at one another. I wasn't just walking out on a dinner. I was withdrawing the only source of genuine light they had ever had. By refusing to play the victim, I had robbed him of his role as the victor. I led Evan out into the cool night air, and as the door clicked shut, I felt the chains of 30 years of golden child worship fall away. That sentence was my declaration of independence. It was the moment I stopped being a Monroe and started being a mother. Evan is 12 now. He's tall, he's kind, and he sits however he wants at our dinner table. We don't talk about Uncle Daniel or Grandma and Grandpa. We talk about his dreams, his friends, and the future. He knows that his value isn't measured in math grades or his ability to sit like a statue. He knows he is a person of worth because I showed him that some bridges are worth burning if they lead to your own dignity. Looking back, that bowl of gravy was the most expensive meal my brother ever served. It cost him his sister, his nephew, and the only person who was willing to overlook his flaws. But I want to ask you something. We've all been at that table in some way, the one where someone makes you feel small just to make themselves feel big. We've all felt the pressure to stay quiet to keep the peace. If you were standing in that foyer, holding your child's hand while they were covered in the evidence of someone else's cruelty, would you have the strength to walk away without a word? Or would you have stayed for dessert?